What if I told you that in 1851, in the heart of Louisiana, a single man's extraordinary beauty became both his greatest curse and his only hope for freedom? What if his story challenged everything we thought we knew about survival, dignity, and the human spirit under the most brutal circumstances? Subscribe now to uncover stories that history tried to bury, and hit that notification bell because what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the cobblestones of Baton Rouge's main square, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the wooden platform erected in the center. It was August 15, 1851, and the air hung thick with humidity and anticipation. The smell of magnolia blossoms mixed with the acrid scent of sweat and fear, creating an atmosphere that was both beautiful and terrifying. Maxwell stood on that platform, his 6'2" frame commanding attention even in chains. At 25 years old, he possessed a striking combination of features that made even the most hardened slave traders pause. His skin was the color of burnished copper, his shoulders broad and powerful from years of labor, yet his face held an aristocratic quality that seemed almost out of place in these circumstances. High cheekbones, deep-set amber eyes, and a jawline that could have been carved from marble. Maxwell was, as the auctioneer would soon proclaim, the handsomest slave ever to grace this platform. But Maxwell's beauty was no accident. It was the result of careful breeding, meticulous grooming, and years of preparation by his previous master, Colonel Beauregard Thornfield of Charleston. Thornfield had acquired Maxwell's mother, Celeste, specifically for her striking features, and had arranged her union with Caesar, a man chosen for his impressive physique and intelligence. Maxwell was their only child, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he was destined to be a showcase, a living testament to Thornfield's ability to produce the finest human specimens. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer's voice boomed across the square, cutting through the murmur of the growing crowd. "Today we present to you a truly exceptional offering. This here is Maxwell, 25 years of age, trained in carpentry, blacksmithing, and household management. But more than his skills, observe his remarkable bearing, his uncommon beauty." The crowd pressed closer, a sea of faces representing the cream of Louisiana society. Plantation owners in their finest suits, their wives fanning themselves delicately while stealing glances at Maxwell, merchants calculating potential profits, and curious onlookers drawn by the spectacle. Among them stood families whose names would echo through Louisiana history: the Boudreaux, the Thibodeaux, the Landrys, all eyeing Maxwell with varying degrees of interest and intent. Maxwell kept his gaze fixed on a point just above the crowd's heads, a technique he had learned years ago to maintain his dignity while being displayed like livestock. But his mind was racing. He had been sold before, this was his third auction, and each time had brought new horrors, new masters who saw his appearance as either a prize to be displayed or a threat to be contained. His first master after Thornfield had been a wealthy widow in Natchez, who had purchased him primarily as a conversation piece for her salon gatherings. She would dress him in fine livery and have him serve tea to her guests, who would comment on his exotic beauty as if he were a rare orchid. The humiliation of being treated as a decorative object had been almost unbearable, but it was nothing compared to what came next. His second master, a brutal overseer named Jeremiah Cask, had bought him specifically to break his spirit. Cask had recognized that Maxwell's striking appearance made him dangerous. Slaves who looked like Maxwell could inspire others, could become symbols of resistance. For 2 years, Cask had tried every method of degradation and torture to crush Maxwell's will, but somehow, impossibly, Maxwell had endured. Now, standing on this platform in Baton Rouge, Maxwell wondered what fresh hell awaited him. The bidding hadn't even begun, and already he could see the hunger in some eyes, the calculation in others. But there was something else, a figure at the edge of the crowd that caught his attention. She was a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with auburn hair pinned severely back and wearing a dark blue dress that spoke of wealth but not ostentation. What struck Maxwell wasn't her appearance, though she was undeniably beautiful in a refined way, but her expression. While others in the crowd looked at him with desire, disgust, or commercial interest, her green eyes held something different, a kind of recognition, as if she saw not a commodity, but a person. "We'll start the bidding at $500, the auctioneer announced, and Maxwell felt his stomach clench. 500 was already more than most slaves brought. His beauty, his skills, his very existence had been commodified to the point where he was worth more than some men would see in a lifetime. 600, called out a portly man in a cream-colored suit. 700, countered a woman with elaborate ringlets and a parasol. The young woman with the auburn hair hadn't moved, hadn't raised her hand or called out a bid. She simply watched, her expression growing more troubled with each escalating offer. Maxwell found himself hoping, irrationally, that she wouldn't bid. Something about her suggested she might be different, and he couldn't bear the thought of being disappointed again. $1,000. The voice came from the back of the crowd, and heads turned to see who had made such an aggressive bid. It was Lucien Boudreau, one of the wealthiest plantation owners in the parish, known for his collection of exceptional slaves and his particular tastes. A murmur ran through the crowd. $1,000 was an extraordinary sum, enough to buy a small farm or a dozen ordinary field hands. Maxwell felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard whispers about Boudreau, about the beautiful slaves who entered his plantation and were never seen again. The young woman's face had gone pale, and Maxwell saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowd, and in that instant, Maxwell saw something that gave him the first spark of hope he had felt in years. She was angry, not at him, but for him. She understood somehow what this auction represented, what his life had become. "Do I hear 1,100?" the auctioneer called out, his voice rising with excitement. This was clearly the most profitable auction he had conducted in months. The silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive. Maxwell could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite his efforts to remain composed. His future hung in the balance, and he was powerless to influence it. All he could do was stand there, a prize to be won, a life to be purchased. Then, clear and strong, a voice cut through the silence. $1,200. Every head in the crowd turned toward the speaker. It was the young woman with the auburn hair, and she was looking directly at Maxwell as she spoke. Her voice didn't waver. Her posture remained straight and determined, but Maxwell could see the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her nervousness. The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. A young, unmarried woman bidding on a male slave, and such a sum, was scandalous beyond measure. But she stood her ground, ignoring the stares and murmurs, her green eyes never leaving Maxwell's face. Lucien Boudreau's face had darkened with anger and surprise. He clearly hadn't expected competition, especially not from this quarter. 1,300, he called out, his voice sharp with irritation. 1,400, the young woman responded immediately, as if she had been expecting his counterbid. Maxwell's heart was pounding now. He didn't know who this woman was or what her intentions might be, but something told him that his life, and possibly his soul, depended on the outcome of this bidding war. The crowd had fallen silent again, sensing the drama unfolding before them. Boudreau was clearly struggling with himself. $1,400 was an enormous sum even for him. His face was red with anger and embarrassment at being challenged so publicly by a mere girl. Maxwell could see him weighing his options, his pride warring with his financial sense. $1,500, Boudreau finally shouted, his voice echoing across the square. The young woman closed her eyes for a moment, and Maxwell saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer. When she opened them again, her resolve seemed even stronger. $2,000. The crowd gasped collectively. $2,000 was an unheard-of sum for a single slave, no matter how exceptional. Even the auctioneer seemed stunned into silence for a moment, before recovering his composure. Boudreau's face had gone from red to purple. He opened his mouth as if to make another bid, then seemed to think better of it. $2,000 was more than he had paid for his last 3 slaves combined. With a curse that made several ladies in the crowd gasp and fan themselves more vigorously, he turned and stalked away from the auction block. "Going once?" the auctioneer called out, his voice cracking with excitement. "Going twice." "Sold to Miss Evangeline Thibodeau for $2,000. As the gavel came down, Maxwell felt his knees nearly buckle with relief and confusion. Evangeline Thibodeau. He now knew her name, though it told him little about what his future might hold. She was already pushing through the crowd toward the platform, her face set with determination, but even as relief flooded through him, Maxwell couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of his story, not the end. He had been saved from Lucien Boudreau, but what did Evangeline Thibodeau want with him? And more importantly, what price would he ultimately have to pay for this unexpected salvation? As the crowd began to disperse and the business of transferring ownership began, Maxwell caught one last glimpse of Evangeline's face. What he saw there surprised him. Not triumph or possession, but something that looked almost like fear. She had just spent an enormous sum to purchase him, but she looked as uncertain about what came next as he felt. The sun was reaching its zenith now, beating down on the square with relentless intensity. Maxwell's new life was about to begin, but whether it would be better or worse than what he had known remained to be seen. All he knew for certain was that Evangeline Thibodeau had just changed both their destinies in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The Thibodeau plantation house rose from the Louisiana landscape like a white-columned monument to southern prosperity. Spanish moss draped the ancient oak trees that lined the approach, creating a natural cathedral that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns of gold and green. As the carriage carrying Maxwell and Evangeline rolled up the crushed shell driveway, Maxwell couldn't help but notice the stark beauty of the place and the dozens of slaves working in the fields who paused to watch their arrival. Evangeline had barely spoken during the hour-long journey from Baton Rouge. She sat rigidly upright, her hands folded in her lap, occasionally glancing at Maxwell before quickly looking away. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions and uncertainties. Maxwell, for his part, was trying to read her intentions, to understand what kind of master or mistress she might prove to be. Miss Evangeline. The voice that greeted them as the carriage stopped belonged to a middle-aged black woman who hurried down the front steps with obvious relief. "Thank the Lord you're back safe. Your father's been pacing the library like a caged panther since you left this morning." "Thank you, Mama Celine," Evangeline replied, and Maxwell noted the genuine warmth in her voice when she addressed the older woman. "Is he very angry?" "Angry ain't the word for it, child. He's been muttering about foolish girls and reckless spending for the better part of 2 hours." Mama Celine's eyes moved to Maxwell, taking in his impressive stature and handsome features with a knowing look. "I see you went through with it." Evangeline's cheeks flushed pink. "We'll discuss it later, Mama Celine. For now, could you please show Maxwell to the quarters and see that he's given something to eat? It's been a long day." "Of course, Miss Evangeline, but you best go face your father before he works himself into a proper fit." As Evangeline disappeared into the house, Mama Celine turned to Maxwell with an appraising look. "Well, well," she said softly, "so you're the one that's got everyone in such a state. Come on then, let's get you settled." Maxwell followed her around the side of the main house toward a collection of small wooden buildings that housed the plantation's slaves. The quarters were better maintained than many he had seen. The buildings were whitewashed and in good repair, with small gardens beside each door where vegetables and flowers grew in neat rows. "You're lucky," Mama Celine said as they walked. "Miss Evangeline's got a good heart, even if she don't always think things through proper. But her father—" She shook her head. "Monsieur Thibodeau ain't going to be pleased about this purchase, not one bit." "Why did she buy me?" Maxwell asked, the question that had been burning in his mind since the auction finally finding voice. Mama Celine stopped walking and turned to study his face. "You really don't know, do you? Child, half the parish has been talking about you since word got out you were coming up for auction, a man with your attributes. Well, let's just say there were some unsavory folks with unsavory plans." Maxwell felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air. "Lucien Boudreau. Among others, Miss Evangeline, she heard the talk, heard what they were planning to do with you." Mama Celine's voice dropped to a whisper. "That girl's got more conscience than sense sometimes. She couldn't stand by and let it happen." They had reached a small cabin at the end of the row, slightly larger than the others, and set apart by a small fence. "This'll be yours," Mama Celine said, opening the door. "It's where we put the house servants and skilled workers. You'll have more privacy here." The cabin was simple but clean, with a bed, a small table, and a wash basin. Compared to the cramped, filthy quarters Maxwell had known at his previous placements, it seemed almost luxurious. A set of clean clothes lay folded on the bed, simple but well-made work clothes that would fit his large frame. "Get yourself cleaned up and changed," Mama Celine instructed. "Then come to the kitchen. I'll have some food ready for you and we can talk about what your duties will be." As she turned to leave, Maxwell called out to her, "Mama Celine, what kind of man is Monsieur Thibodeau?" She paused in the doorway, her expression thoughtful. "He's a hard man but fair in his way, treats his slaves better than most, long as they do their work and don't cause trouble. But he's got a temper, and he don't like being crossed, especially not by his daughter." She gave Maxwell a meaningful look. "You best hope Miss Evangeline can make him see reason about this purchase, because if he decides you're more trouble than you're worth—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Maxwell had seen what happened to slaves who were deemed troublesome. The fact that he had cost $2,000 might protect him somewhat, but it could just as easily make Thibodeau more resentful of his presence. After Mama Celine left, Maxwell sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning he had been the property of a slave trader, facing an uncertain and likely terrible future. Now he was owned by a young woman who had apparently bought him out of some misguided sense of mercy. But mercy from a white person, he had learned, often came with its own price. He changed into the clean clothes and washed his face and hands in the basin, grateful for the simple luxury of clean water and soap. As he prepared to go to the kitchen, he caught sight of himself in the small mirror hanging on the wall. The face that looked back at him was the same one that had caused so much trouble throughout his life. The face that made him valuable as a commodity and dangerous as a symbol. The kitchen was a bustling hub of activity, with several women preparing what appeared to be an elaborate dinner. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread filled the air, making Maxwell's stomach growl with hunger. He hadn't eaten since dawn, and the stress of the auction had left him feeling weak and shaky. "Sit yourself down," Mama Celine commanded, gesturing to a small table in the corner. She placed a plate before him, loaded with cornbread, beans, and a generous portion of pork. "Eat up, you're gonna need your strength." As Maxwell ate, he became aware of the other slaves in the kitchen stealing glances at him. Word of his arrival had clearly spread quickly through the quarters. A young woman about his own age approached the table, her curiosity overcoming her shyness. "Is it true you cost $2,000? She asked in a whisper. "Hush now, Marie," Mama Celine scolded. "Mind your own business." But Maxwell nodded to the young woman. "It's true." Marie's eyes widened. "Lord have mercy. I ain't never heard of anyone paying that much for anyone." "That's because he ain't just anyone," said an older man who had been quietly observing from across the room. "Name's Samuel," he said to Maxwell. "I'm the head groom here. Been working for the Thibodeau family for near 20 years. Samuel approached the table and sat down across from Maxwell. "You got skills besides looking pretty?" he asked bluntly. "Carpentry, blacksmithing, some mechanical work," Maxwell replied. "I can read and write, do figures." Samuel's eyebrows rose. "Read and write? That's unusual. Most masters don't want their slaves getting educated." "My first master believed in developing his investments," Maxwell said carefully. "Well, you're gonna need all those skills and more if you want to survive here," Samuel said. "Monsieur Thibodeau don't suffer fools, and he's already none too happy about Miss Evangeline's purchase. You best prove your worth quick, or you might find yourself sold again before the month is out." Before Maxwell could respond, the sound of raised voices drifted in from the main house. Even through the thick walls, they could hear the anger in Monsieur Thibodeau's voice, though the words were indistinct. "Sounds like Miss Evangeline's getting the lecture of her life," Marie whispered. Mama Celine shot her a warning look. "That's enough gossip. Y'all get back to work. Dinner won't cook itself." As the kitchen staff returned to their duties, Samuel leaned closer to Maxwell. "Listen to me, boy. I've seen men like you before, men whose looks make them targets. You got two choices here. You can try to blend in, keep your head down, and hope nobody notices you, or you can use what God gave you to your advantage. But either way, you better decide quick, because this plantation's about to become a very dangerous place for you." "What do you mean?" Maxwell asked. "Miss Evangeline may have saved you from Boudreaux, but she's just a girl, and girls don't run plantations. Her father does. And if he decides you're a threat to his authority or his daughter's reputation? Samuel shook his head. $2,000 won't save you then. The voices from the main house had grown louder, and now they could clearly hear Evangeline's voice, raised in response to her father's anger. Maxwell couldn't make out the words, but the tone was defiant, determined. "She's got spirit, I'll give her that," Samuel said with grudging admiration. "But spirit only goes so far when you're dealing with a man like Monsieur Thibodeau." As if summoned by their conversation, the kitchen door burst open, and Evangeline herself appeared, her face flushed with anger and her hair slightly disheveled. She looked around the kitchen until her eyes found Maxwell. "You," she said, pointing at him, "come with me, now." Maxwell stood uncertainly, glancing at Mama Celine for guidance. The older woman nodded grimly. "Go on," she said, "and remember what I told you about keeping your head down." Maxwell followed Evangeline out of the kitchen and across the yard toward the main house. She walked quickly, her skirts swishing with each determined step. As they climbed the back stairs to the house, she finally spoke. "My father wants to meet you," she said without looking back. "He's not pleased with my purchase. You're going to need to convince him that you're worth the money I paid for you." "And if I can't?" Maxwell asked. Evangeline stopped at the top of the stairs and turned to face him. In the fading daylight, her green eyes looked almost luminous. "Then we're both in trouble," she said simply. She led him through a series of hallways, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and into a large library where floor-to-ceiling shelves held hundreds of leather-bound volumes. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat a man who could only be Monsieur Thibodeau. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His clothes were expensive but understated, and his pale blue eyes held an intelligence that Maxwell recognized as potentially dangerous. This was not a man who could be easily fooled or manipulated. "So," Thibodeau said without preamble, "you're the slave my daughter saw fit to purchase for the outrageous sum of $2,000. His voice was cultured, with only a slight French accent betraying his Creole heritage. "Yes, sir," Maxwell replied, keeping his voice steady and respectful. Thibodeau stood and walked around the desk, circling Maxwell like a buyer examining a horse. "I can see why you commanded such a price," he said finally. "You're certainly impressive. But beauty fades, boy. What else can you offer?" "I'm skilled in carpentry and blacksmithing, sir. I can read, write, and cipher. I've managed household staff and supervised fieldwork." "Educated, are you?" Thibodeau's eyebrows rose. "That's unusual and potentially dangerous. Educated slaves have a tendency to get ideas above their station." "I understand my place, sir," Maxwell said carefully. "Do you?" Thibodeau moved to stand directly in front of Maxwell, studying his face intently. "Because your place has just become considerably more complicated. My daughter seems to believe she's rescued you from some terrible fate, but what she's actually done is create a problem for this entire household." Evangeline, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward. "Father, I explained to you why I—" "Silence!" Thibodeau's voice cracked like a whip. "You've said quite enough for one day, Evangeline. This is between me and my new investment." He turned back to Maxwell. "You see, boy, my daughter may have purchased you with the best of intentions, but intentions don't change reality. You're a young, handsome male slave in a household with an unmarried daughter. Do you understand what that means?" Maxwell felt his stomach clench. He understood perfectly. "Yes, sir." "Good. Then you understand that your very presence here is a scandal waiting to happen. The neighbors are already talking, and if there's even a whisper of impropriety between you and my daughter—" Thibodeau let the threat hang in the air. "There won't be, sir," Maxwell said firmly. "Won't there?" Thibodeau smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're a fine specimen, I'll grant you that, and my daughter is a beautiful young woman who's shown remarkably poor judgment today. You'll forgive me if I don't take your word for it." He walked back to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a set of papers. "These are your ownership documents. As of today, you belong to this plantation, to this family. But make no mistake. If you cause any trouble, any scandal, any disruption to the order of this household, I will sell you so fast your head will spin, and I won't be particular about who I sell you to." Maxwell nodded, understanding the threat completely. "I understand, sir. I hope you do." Thibodeau sat back down behind his desk. "Now, as for your duties, you'll work primarily as a carpenter and general handyman. There's always something that needs fixing or building on a plantation this size. You'll take your orders from Samuel, and you'll stay away from the main house unless specifically summoned. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Evangeline will show you out." Thibodeau picked up a ledger and began writing, effectively dismissing them both. As they left the library and walked back through the house, Evangeline was quiet, her earlier defiance replaced by what looked like regret. Only when they were outside did she finally speak. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't think... I mean, I knew he'd be angry, but I didn't realize how difficult this would make things for you." Maxwell stopped walking and turned to face her. In the gathering twilight, she looked younger than her 20 years, and for the first time since the auction, he saw uncertainty in her green eyes. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "Why did you spend $2,000 on a stranger?" Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I've heard the stories about what men like Boudreau do to slaves like you. Because I couldn't stand by and watch another human being be destroyed for the entertainment of monsters." She looked up at him, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. "Because it was the right thing to do, even if it was also the stupid thing to do." Maxwell felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. When was the last time someone had seen him as a human being rather than a commodity? When had anyone ever risked anything for his sake? "Thank you," he said simply. Evangeline nodded and turned to go, then paused. "Maxwell, be careful. My father meant what he said about selling you if there's any trouble. And there are people on this plantation who won't be happy about your arrival. People who might try to cause that trouble." "I understand," Maxwell said. "I'll be careful." As he watched her walk back to the main house, Maxwell realized that his situation was even more precarious than he had initially thought. He had been saved from one form of hell, only to find himself in another, more subtle trap. Evangeline Thibodeau had bought him out of compassion, but that compassion might ultimately destroy them both. The night was falling fast now, and Maxwell could hear the sounds of the plantation settling into evening routines. Somewhere in the distance, a slave was singing a mournful spiritual, the melody carrying across the fields like a prayer. Maxwell stood there for a moment, listening to the song and trying to understand what his life had become. He was no longer just a slave. He was a symbol, a scandal, a problem to be managed. His beauty, which had always been his curse, was now more dangerous than ever. But for the first time in years, he also felt something else: hope. Evangeline Thibodeau had seen his humanity, had risked everything to preserve it. Now it was up to him to prove that her faith hadn't been misplaced. As he walked back to his cabin, Maxwell began to formulate a plan. He would work harder than any slave on the plantation. He would prove his worth through his skills and his dedication. He would stay away from Evangeline and avoid any hint of scandal. And somehow, some way, he would find a way to repay the debt he owed to the young woman who had saved his life. But even as he made these resolutions, Maxwell couldn't shake the feeling that forces beyond his control were already in motion. Forces that would test not only his resolve, but his very survival. The game had changed, but it was far from over. 3 weeks had passed since Maxwell's arrival at the Thibodeau plantation, and the rhythm of his new life had begun to establish itself. Each morning before dawn, he would rise and make his way to the workshop that had been set up for him in one of the outbuildings. His days were filled with the honest work of carpentry and repair, fixing broken wagon wheels, building new shelves for the main house, crafting furniture for the slave quarters. The work was satisfying in a way that Maxwell hadn't experienced in years. Under his previous masters, his labor had been either purely decorative or deliberately degrading. Here his skills were valued and put to good use. Samuel had proven to be a fair supervisor, and the other slaves had gradually accepted his presence, though he remained somewhat apart from their close-knit community. Maxwell had been careful to follow Monsieur Thibodeau's instructions to the letter. He stayed away from the main house unless specifically summoned, kept his interactions with the other slaves professional and friendly, but not intimate, and worked with a dedication that impressed even the most skeptical observers. He had seen Evangeline only twice since that first evening, once when she had brought him a list of repairs needed in the main house, and once when she had passed by the workshop while he was building a new chicken coop. Both encounters had been brief and formal, but Maxwell had noticed the way her eyes lingered on his work, the small smile that crossed her face when she saw the quality of his craftsmanship. There was something in those moments that suggested she was pleased with her purchase, that she felt vindicated in her decision to save him from Boudreaux's clutches. But Maxwell was not naive enough to believe that his situation was stable. He could feel the undercurrents of tension that ran through the plantation like underground streams. Some of the house slaves whispered about the scandal of his presence, about the impropriety of a young, unmarried woman owning such a man. The field hands were more direct in their resentment. They saw him as pampered, as receiving special treatment because of his appearance. Most concerning of all was the attention he had begun to receive from beyond the plantation's boundaries. Twice in the past week, visitors had come to the main house specifically to see the famous slave that Evangeline had purchased. Word of the auction and the extraordinary price paid had spread throughout the parish, and Maxwell had become something of a curiosity, a conversation piece for the local gentry. It was on a humid Thursday morning that the situation finally came to a head. Maxwell was in the workshop, carefully sanding a piece of mahogany that would become part of a new dining table for the main house, when Samuel appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely controlled anger. "You need to come with me," Samuel said without preamble. "Now." Maxwell set down his sandpaper and followed Samuel out of the workshop. Instead of heading toward the main house or the fields, Samuel led him toward the slave quarters, where a crowd had gathered around one of the smaller cabins. As they approached, Maxwell could hear raised voices and what sounded like a woman crying. The crowd parted as Samuel pushed through, revealing a scene that made Maxwell's blood run cold. Marie, the young woman who had spoken to him in the kitchen on his first day, was sitting on the ground outside her cabin, her dress torn and her face bruised. Standing over her was a white man Maxwell didn't recognize, a thin, weaselly-looking individual with pale skin and nervous eyes. "What's going on here?" Samuel demanded. The white man turned, and Maxwell saw him relax slightly when he realized he was only facing slaves. "Nothing that concerns you, boy. This is between me and the girl." "Like hell it is," Samuel shot back, his usual deference to white authority notably absent. "This is Thibodeau property, and you got no business here." "I got every right to be here," the man replied, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "Name's Jeremiah Kask, and I'm here on official business." Maxwell felt his knees nearly buckle at the name. Jeremiah Kask, his former master, the man who had spent 2 years trying to break his spirit. What was he doing here? Kask's eyes swept the crowd and stopped when they found Maxwell. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well, if it isn't my old friend Maxwell. Heard you'd landed yourself in quite the comfortable situation here." "You know this man?" Samuel asked Maxwell, his voice tight with suspicion. "He was my master before I was sold to the trader," Maxwell replied, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "That's right," Kask said, his smile growing wider. "And I'm here to collect what's owed to me. You see, when Maxwell here was sold, there were certain irregularities in the paperwork. Seems the trader didn't have clear title to sell him." Samuel's face had gone ashen. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Maxwell's sale was illegal. He still belongs to me, and I'm here to take him back." Kask waved the paper in his hand. "Got the court documents right here to prove it." The crowd of slaves had grown silent, sensing the gravity of the situation. Maxwell felt the world spinning around him as the implications of Kask's words sank in. If what he was saying was true, then Evangeline's purchase had been meaningless. He would be dragged back to the hell he had escaped, and this time Kask would make sure he never got another chance at freedom. "That's impossible," Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Miss Evangeline bought him fair and square at a legal auction." "Legal auction maybe, but illegal merchandise," Kask replied. "The trader who sold him didn't have proper ownership papers. I never signed a bill of sale. Maxwell ran away from my plantation 2 years ago, and I've been tracking him ever since." Maxwell's mind raced. It was true that he had escaped from Cask's plantation, but he had been recaptured within days and sold to the trader as punishment. He had assumed that all the legal formalities had been properly handled, but now he realized that Cask might have deliberately left the paperwork incomplete, knowing that he could use it as leverage later. "Where's Monsieur Thibodeau?" Samuel asked. "He needs to see these papers." "Already seen him," Cask said smugly. "He's reviewing the documents with his lawyer right now. But the law is clear. Stolen property has to be returned to its rightful owner, regardless of who might have purchased it in good faith." As if summoned by the conversation, Monsieur Thibodeau himself appeared, striding across the yard with his face set in grim lines. Behind him walked Evangeline, her face pale but determined. Maxwell's heart sank when he saw the defeated expression in Thibodeau's eyes. "The documents appear to be legitimate," Thibodeau announced to the assembled crowd. "Mr. Cask has legal claim to Maxwell. The sale must be reversed." "No!" Evangeline stepped forward, her voice ringing with authority. "I don't care what those papers say. I paid $2,000 for Maxwell, and he belongs to this plantation now." "Evangeline, please," her father said wearily. "The law is the law. We cannot keep stolen property, no matter how much we paid for it." "He's not stolen property," Evangeline's voice rose to nearly a shout. "He's a human being, and I won't let him be dragged back to that monster." Cask's smile had turned predatory. Now, Miss Thibodeau, no need for dramatics. I'm just reclaiming what's rightfully mine. Though I must say I'm curious about why you're so invested in this particular slave's welfare." The implication in his voice was clear, and Maxwell saw Thibodeau's face darken with anger. "Watch your tongue, Cask. You may have legal claim to the slave, but you'll show proper respect to my daughter." Of course, Cask said, but his eyes remained fixed on Evangeline with a knowing look that made Maxwell's skin crawl. "I'm sure Miss Thibodeau's interest is purely humanitarian." Maxwell knew he had to act. The situation was spiraling out of control, and soon Evangeline's reputation would be destroyed, along with his own freedom. He stepped forward, drawing all eyes to himself. "Mr. Cask," he said, his voice calm and respectful, "if you have legal claim to me, then I'll come with you. There's no need to involve the Thibodeau family in this dispute." "Maxwell, no." Evangeline turned to him with desperation in her eyes. "You don't understand what he'll do to you." "I understand perfectly," Maxwell replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "But I won't be the cause of scandal or trouble for this family. You've shown me more kindness than I had any right to expect, and I won't repay that by destroying your reputation." Cask clapped his hands together with mock delight. "How noble! How touching! Yes, Maxwell, you'll come with me. Right now, in fact. I have a wagon waiting on the road." "Wait," Thibodeau said suddenly. "Mr. Cask, while your legal claim may be valid, I did pay $2,000 for this slave in good faith. Surely some compensation is in order." Cask's expression turned calculating. "Well, now that's between you and the trader who sold him to you illegally. I'm not responsible for your poor judgment in purchasing stolen goods." "Perhaps not," Thibodeau replied, "but I'm sure we can come to some arrangement. After all, you wouldn't want word to spread that you're in the habit of selling slaves without proper documentation. It might hurt your business reputation." For the first time, Cask looked uncertain. Maxwell could see him weighing his options, trying to decide how much he could push without creating problems for himself. "I might be willing to discuss some form of compensation," Cask said finally. "But it would have to be substantial. This is a very valuable piece of property we're talking about." "Indeed it is," Thibodeau agreed. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in private. Evangeline, please escort our guest to the library. I'll join you shortly." As Evangeline reluctantly led Cask toward the main house, Thibodeau turned to Maxwell. "You," he said quietly, "come with me." Maxwell followed Thibodeau to a small office behind the main house that served as the plantation's business center. Once inside, Thibodeau closed the door and turned to face him with an expression Maxwell couldn't read. "Tell me the truth," Thibodeau said. "Did you run away from Cask's plantation?" Maxwell met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir, I did." "Why?" Maxwell hesitated, then decided that honesty was his only option. "Because he was trying to break me, sir. Not just my body, but my spirit. He wanted to turn me into something less than human, and I couldn't let that happen. Thibodeau nodded slowly. And you were recaptured? Yes, sir, within 3 days. He had me beaten and then sold me to the trader as punishment. But he never signed proper ownership papers with the trader. I don't know, sir. I assumed he had, but... Maxwell shrugged helplessly. Thibodeau was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the fields where his slaves were working. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. You know, Maxwell, I've built this plantation through careful planning and attention to detail. I don't like surprises, and I don't like being made to look foolish.